guys, Pat here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And today I'm working on my little excavator, my Volvo ECR88. Ever since I acquired it at an auction, it's kind of been slow to start when it's cold. And I've replaced one of the ground leads that was loose. I can show you that here in a few minutes. I changed out the starter, put a new starter in, it acted the same. So I put the old starter back in because the old starter was still good. When I first got the machine, when I was looking at some of the cold start issues, this boot was actually burnt off of the cover that goes over top of the terminal. This was hard crystallized, melted, and actually feels just a little bit loose. And I tried to crimp this on there better, didn't seem to work. Sheathing here, as you can see, has been really hot. So one of the biggest problems with electrical systems are the connections, the butt connectors, spade connectors, any of your connectors. The wire itself, there is impedance. I mean, matter of fact, the definition of 1 ohm is 1,000 feet of number 10 copper wire. The length of that whole wire, you have 1 ohm resistance. So through all wire you have resistance. So what you got here is a crimp, and you have this little spade coming off of here, and then when it goes onto a stud or whatever, or battery post or whatever it's connecting, there's less material here than there is in the actual wire itself. So the trick is to have the best connections you can possibly have, clean connections, put antioxidant on your connections so they don't get oxidized, and good tight connections. So wherever you have a screw connection, you make sure they're nice and solid. So anyway, you can see here, this is the other end, and you can see where it got hot there. This wire is still very, very flexible. If you look at these are really nice heavy duty connectors. I like these. But the weak link again, especially if these get oxidized on the inside of here and they start making a poor connection, they get dirty, they get wet, wet, dry. Eventually oxygen will get to the copper and it'll start turning a dingy dark color. You see how these are nice and bright? Well, this connector here used to be the same color. The wires themselves used to be the same color, but they get tarnished over time. Well, that's oxidation, and that's just a problem with time and metals coming into contact with air and moisture. The other thing that I noticed on these, if I pull these back and maybe show you, instead of the copper color, there's like an orange color to those wires. Orange, red, sometimes blue, pink. That's just an indication that this has been really hot. Now the other indication, other than the melted sheathing, is if you look at this connection right here, this has been very hot running into the starter brushes to run the starter. A constant repeat on the ignition switch to get the engine started will cause a lot of heat. That engine should crank over relatively quickly. This wire still has a lot of flexibility to it, but you can see where the connections have been super hot in the cranking process, laying on the starter too much, especially in colder weather. So I'm trying to prevent that. You can see where it's been hot in here. You can kind of see the dark, tarnished look to where the terminal actually seats on that lug. Here you can see the nut. It's tarnished, not necessarily from rust, but just from heat, cooling, heat, cooling. I'll take you over here and show you how I removed the old wire, where the new wire is going to replace the old wire through the same piece of conduit. So you can see here, this is what they call a fish tape, and I used this to pull the old wire out. I taped the old wire, and I actually taped it from the other side, of the machine. But I taped this on here with black tape, and taped up the end here to where it was a little rounded and didn't have any abrupt edges, and pulled it through the conduit. It's material like this little black corrugated sheathing or conduit, and that goes through the bottom inside the machine. So you can see the conduit right there. I have the fish tape running clear through that to the other side. So that's where the wire's going to pop out, and I'll have a terminal lug similar to this one, except for 5/16 hole to fit that 5/16 stud on the on the back side of the starter. So that's going to go back through here into this conduit, through the internals of the machine. This goes back up through and around to where the starter goes. And so this conduit, you can see my fish tape. Once I put a terminal like this one on the other side, except for this is 3/8, the other one on the other side is going to be 5/16 to match the stud size of the starter. It's really critical, especially when you're messing with high current. Starters always have a high current, high draw. You want the hole and the crimp size to be the same size as the wire and the post or stud that you're going to be going onto. If you have like a 3/8, you're going to have a lot of slop in here. You want to have the maximum amount of contact area between where the stud, nut, washer, all that stuff can have the most contact possible. You know, you can have, this is the 4/0 welding cable that I used I built this jumper here, because the other one, the old one, when I was troubleshooting this end and the other end, they were just soldered, they wasn't crimped. This particular end is crimped and soldered on this end and at the switch. So I know that this is a good chunk, solid cable that's going to be running to the negative side of the battery. So now we're working on the positive side of the battery. So starters, they get hit pretty hard with time. So I went ahead and just bought a new starter, because I knew eventually I'd probably be using it, replacing this one. And this one here still works fine. I'm just ruling everything out. I'm going to put this on the shelf. It's still going to be a good starter, but I want to put this brand new one on there just to rule out any issues, because they're hard to take out and put back in because they're on the back side of the engine. You have to go underneath the exhaust, and the air cleaner I had to remove, and it's just hard getting your fingers in there. So I'm just going to go ahead and put this brand new one in here with that brand new cable. I have this 5/16 by 2/0. You see how nicely that fits in there? Nice and tight fit. What I'll do is I'm going to saturate this with soldering flux. I'm going to warm this up, dip it in the flux. I'm going to clean this up with a brush, put flux inside here, and I'm going to put the fitting on. I'm going to crimp it. Actually, you put this on, you put it back here to where it won't get hot. Then you crimp it, and then you take and heat this up and feed solder in between the sheathing and the soldering bell, I guess you might call that. This hole is going to be a 5/16 hole, which is going to fit the stud on the new starter. Then I'm going to tape, after this is already prepared, and I put the shrink tubing on there and get it all shrunk, and this side's ready to go. I'm going to tape this side to the fish tape and then attempt to pull this through that conduit. This wire is just a little bit bigger than the wire that I'm using, to alleviate any resistance that might be in the old cable. So if the old cable's compromised due to the heat that's been gone through there since 2013, when it was installed in the excavator, hopefully the new cable and a new starter will take care of any anomalies. Okay, so the first thing we'll do, we'll take this back, slip this back, slip this off, make sure I pick up the right one, because this one goes over the battery. See the differences of the holes. This is for the 3/8 inch stud on the battery. This is for the 5/16 stud on the starter. So I'll clean these up, take a wire brush and clean up the inside of that. And roughen that up a little bit to accept the solder. I do not skimp on soldering flux, and I don't skimp on the solder itself either. I'm going to warm this up and then dip it into the soldering flux, so the soldering flux surrounds every single one of those copper strands. Now, some of you might be saying, "Oh, you're wasting your time. All you need to do is just crimp it. It's good enough." Or you might just say, "Oh, you might just solder it. That's good enough." But the old ground going from the battery switch to the ground, that's what they did. They just went ahead and soldered it. Well, that joint got loose and it came apart. So I am of the mindset, now I filled that full of flux, so that should push the rest of the way in to the backside or barrel of the terminal connector. So we're going to go over and we're going to go ahead and crimp this. Okay, here we are at our little hydraulic portable crimping tool, and I have 2/0 dies in here. So I'll go back to where the flare is on the back side of this connector. Okay, I want to make sure I get the 5/16 hole. So this is going to go on the starter, because this side I'm going to try to pull back through the conduit to the battery. And then I'm not going to put an end on this right away, because this end here won't fit through the conduit. Okay, now I got just enough pressure on the dies to hold this in place. And it's nice putting this in a vise. That way you can use this hand to apply pressure to the wire to bring that up tight. And then I can use the other hand to just apply pressure or to crimp the wire together. I'm pulling apart here. I've got the crimps. They're actually all the way together. They can't go together any further. So now I'm going to release. There's a little hydraulic release on the back side here. Okay. And I have a crimp. So now what I'll do is I'm going to go over here to the soldering solder and put solder in here and fill this void, as well as having a crimp. I think that is by far the best way to do this. Okay, now it's just a matter of heating this up. And I got this big adjustable wrench here, hopefully to support this and keep this from moving around. Keep that suspended a little bit and in place. A little bit downwards here to where the solder to flow into the barrel of this this connector. And we'll see if we can catch something on fire. Yes, I know the wood's down here and everything, but I don't plan on being down there with the torch. I heat from the back side and let the heat work around the fitting, and then feed the solder in from the opposite side. So also heating down here versus up here, that way this isn't cold. If it starts to melt up in here, and I'm heating down here on the opposite side, it starts to melt up here. I know the whole thing is hot enough to accept solder, and I won't have any cold soldering joints on the inside. This might not be the prettiest thing in the world, but I can clean this up a little bit with alcohol and a wire brush, and I can see my solder has penetrated all of the strands of the copper. So I'll just let that dry cool so I don't have any cold solder joints. Now what alcohol does, it just cleans up. It cleans up the soldering flux and just cleans up the copper. Just want to make sure it's cool enough before I start monkeying with it. This was a little rough when I bought it at the store. Kind of boogered up a little bit. And I got plenty here. Actually, I got about a foot more. I just bought what they had left. So I'm going to take these pliers and clean that end up. I won't cut this back until I pull it through the conduit. And of course the last step is to put the shrink tubing on here. Now I guess hindsight, I should have slid this back just a little bit further, but I like to get as far onto the edge here as I can. This is just some heat shrink that the manufacturers gave to you. So now this is ready for application to the stud right here, and this end here we're going to go ahead and get attached to the fish tape. That was a waste of black tape, but you never know until you try. We'll put just a little bit of tape over top of this to hopefully not get any of the wires to be poking the inside of the conduit. And we'll see if we can feed this through. And I got my lovely bride here to give me a hand so she can twist the wire. She's going to twist it around clockwise or counterclockwise or whatever she wants to do. And I'm going to try to feed it through this conduit. So we shut the camera off. I had Heidi out here help me to push this wire in, and it just would not go in here. So I got some dishwashing liquid and I poured it in the conduit and run the wire in there a little bit, pull it back out, put some more dish soap in there, and it slid right through. It was really actually worked out pretty nice that way. Yeah, it slid through real nice now, and soap doesn't hurt anything. Clean this up. Now I'm pushing back on this, just enough grip on the terminal and a little back pressure on the wire. Now I can rest the handle up against my leg and obviously hold it with my left hand while I'm crimping with the right hand. Now the shrink tubing is big enough to where I can slip it over top of the terminal, but I could have stuck it on there to start with. Okay, now that's coming up tight. I'll let off on the pressure, and we have a crimp. Now this is what I like to see. Lots of flux in there. Some people might say, man, you're wasting a lot of flux, but I don't really care. I'd rather see it doing this than not see it at all and wonder if I had enough flux in there. All right. I really should have put that on there first. That way I wouldn't have got a big old mess of flux everywhere. Hindsight, I guess I could have wiped it off. I must admit, that's not the prettiest job. This sheathing should have been right up against this flare, but hey, I wouldn't consider myself a professional. And I'll set this in here just a little back, just a little bit farther, and it'll take on a little bit more of this sheathing here, overlap it a little better. Put a little bit of antioxidant paste on here. And on the other side. Now we're not going to hook the battery up right away. We'll hook up all the other devices first. The other thing that we have to do is put an end on here. With the last crimp, this was actually in the other crimp, but this is exactly 2/0, where the other one had 2 forks that folded over and encase these 2 wires. So we'll have to make another connector to this so it goes on the positive side of the battery. Okay, so now with these 2 smaller hot leads that still go to the battery positive, I made a battery jumper cable connection to my battery that goes into one of these plug-ins. So if I have to have a jump for the excavator, I don't have to remove this big panel right here in order to get to the battery to get myself a jump. So I cut this off and I'll bunch these all together onto one connection. These are already heated up and put flux on them, but I'll put a little bit of cold flux on there so I can stuff that in the entrance to the connector. This time I went ahead and put my heat shrink on. Okay. This time I'm going to have to kind of hold it like this and use the tread for a backstop. Now we'll go try to put that starter back in and start putting things together. Now the starter has to go way back in behind there, and there's no sense in you guys being on camera to watch me fight that. We'll get back with you when I get done. Guys, before I run out of battery power, I want to see if this thing starts. That actually worked out pretty good. I could feel it really turning over fast. So anyway, I'm glad that worked out. If you guys have issues with your machines turning over sluggish, and it might not be the battery, it could just be the connections to the battery, from the ground to the negative side of the battery, and then from the positive clear over to the starter. So anyway, thanks for stopping by. Take care, and God bless.